Right on. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Greetings to all of you. Really appreciate you having me here. Um, I know for many of us, can you see this?
Yes.
Great. The fact that you can see this and also hear me is pretty exceptional. Conquering so much already. It's a tremendous privilege to be here. I think some of you may be well within your rights to be suspicious of any artist that any institution would trust. But in balance with that suspicion, I invite you to share with me the shared stakes of the outlier. And artists are that. We are the stewards of the outer edges of the public imagination. Somebody has to help us dream of something else. My name is Marc Bamuthi Joseph. I'm Anne-Marie Deltour's grandson. I'm Makai Rising's father. My people come from the unceded territory of the Taino people, which is presently known as Haiti. I currently live in the unceded territory of the Nanachuk people, which is presently known as Washington, D.C. I've had the great privilege of working with federal institutions, global institutions. This piece that you're seeing right now, this slide is from the first time I interacted with the Kennedy Center. My body doesn't really do this anymore, but I like to think that the way that I lead looks like this: virtuosic and dynamic and gyroscopic and alive. This is my first engagement of the National Cultural Center of the United States, where I am now a vice president. I say all this to say that by virtue of my body, my citizenship, and my relationship to institutional power, I identify as both privileged and hunted. And at that intersection, my work is less about safeguarding artistic freedoms and more about the design of freedom itself. I wish to speak to you of two things. I want to speak of a transformative future and of the currencies of redemption. Not the future of design, but how we design the future. Not the currency of manufacture, but how what we manufacture is redeemed, the future and the units of cultural redemption, the specter of equity and the parameters of social transformation. As I was coming in today, I heard folks talking about economics. So I guess a good place to start maybe is with some questions of value. What if dignity were currency and our business models depended on spinning the capital of dignity into the capital of finance? What if when we said equity, we didn't mean everybody's in the house? We meant equity like what you have if you own your house. Invested in inclusion to produce equity for diverse communities, which means more than putting on shows or producing symbols. What if all this dis-ease was a prompt for an entrepreneurial reframe, like the explosion of crypto as currency? What if we treated the art of cultivating dignity as an intentional economy? If the product were empathy and you had to make it, and you had to make it mass accessible, what raw materials would you use? What if dignity were currency and the raw material to make it was culture? What if you worked at a cultural mint and you printed white walls and bright lights in the aesthetic sublime 80% of the time, but 20% of every dime was spent minting cultural equity for the historically left behind? Equity, not like proportional balance, equity like profit on your P&L balance. Who in your country is manufacturing empathy? Just a little bit. And in the end, wouldn't we all benefit? What if dignity were medicine, were a vaccine, and the public and private sector teamed up to invest in our collective healing, and our country's cultural mints were the place where anybody could get pricked with a sharp edge of culture, a chemical boost, included us all? Because what we've just learned is that if I'm healthy and you're sick, I'm at risk. Why risk emerging from this moment in a culturally unhealthy way? Why put a cultural inflection point to waste? What if the product were collective healing? And in order to do it, we had to practice more cooperative economics, except no one would buy it if it wasn't fly. So to heal, we had to invest in artists, invested in their individual projects, but used artist intellect to mass produce dignity and put as much equity in it as you would a non-fungible token of a digital object. We make value. Diversity is not a stock to be left alone to accrue. Diversity is a paper-thin bill that you got to keep stacking, or else you're not serious. What if you were making a city? How many great artists does it take to make a great city? How many artists does it take to make any country great? If you had equity stakes in empathy, who would you invest in first? In the ecosystem of cultural production, what if we all win if we all win? What if we didn't all have to win? We just all remembered when the world was sick and collective healing was something we were all invested in. What if nobody got left behind? What if we healed forward, cardinal directions, truth, dimension, humanity, access, latitudes of public imagination, longitudinal public policy, XYZ axis, access the ancestors, call their names, map the future. Collective dignity, the moral compass, invest in the road forward, culture as brick, walk the walk. Now, I host a podcast called Active Hope with Paula Prestini and Camila Forbes. Paula is the co-founder of National Sawdust in Brooklyn, New York. Camila is the executive producer of the Apollo Theater in Harlem. We had one recent guest, a woman named Marina Gorbis, who serves as the executive director of the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. I want to play a piece of our conversation, a recent conversation that we had, and then I want to share some ways that my work aligns with her framing. This is Marina Gorbis.
Can you just talk maybe a little bit about how you define variations in futures or in future perspectives?
Yeah. There are many different approaches to thinking about the future. You know, scenarios is one of the methodologies we use. And particular methodology we use is called alternative futures methodology that actually comes from Dr. Data, who is a futurist and was teaching at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And he posited, and we believe in that, you know, when you think about all these visions of the future, there are four sort of archetypal ways in which we think about the future and construct scenarios in our minds. Mm-hmm. One is what we call growth, which is basically continuation of things as they've always been. It doesn't necessarily mean growth, but it means like we're going to continue on the same path. And that's the easiest thing to envision. It's what we all think about, you know, every day, that things will pretty much continue as they've been. The other sort of archetypal scenario is collapse. So something is really falling apart, something is breaking. It could be a system or a subsystem. Now we're talking about climate collapse and things like that. So interesting enough, a lot of people love envisioning collapse because things are complex. We live in a very complex world and it's hard to change. So why don't we just start anew? We just destroy what's there and build something new. The other one is constraint. So you're operating under the environment of some form of constraint. So now we're talking about resource constraint, like water shortages and things like that, where you need to constrain your behaviors. There's a limitation. And my favorite one, and really the one that's the hardest for people to think about, is transformation, where we're really moving into something very, very different. We're not destroying it, but we're transforming into something new. And that's the hardest one for people to envision, mostly because when people think about the future, what's difficult about it is that they base it on their own personal experience. And let's take a lifespan, at most 100 years about, right? And so we kind of come to believe that everything that we do and how we behave and how things work is that's the only way to be in the world, right? Like it's almost like preordained. This is what it is, We go to work from 9 to 5. We take vacations for a month, we do this. The school is followed by maybe college, by work, and all of these things. So we think in these sets that are very sort of deterministic in some way. And when you think about transformation, you really have to put yourself into some very other space. And that's why artists are so important. I always say that artists are futurists, just inherently futurists, because artists are able to envision something that we have not experienced, that may not exist, or they have to reformulate it in a very substantial way.
I think of theater as the multimedia codification of narrative in real time in finite space. But I also think of theaters as the prime social space for liberatory pedagogy, organized around hope and art-centered strategies for a transformative future. Think about what Marina was just describing and imagine ourselves at our most optimized. Are we constrained? Are we collapsing? Are we growing, which is not to say escalating, but moving apace? Or are we transformative? How does a culturally transformative storyteller think about the nexus that we are currently approaching and standing upon? What I do at the Kennedy Center is I organize our work not in terms of healing the past, but designing the future. And I have a framework that I use here. Maybe we'll get to talk about it later on down the line, but essentially it's these 4 Ps. Rather than thinking about programs, I think about a theory of change. The idea of art for non-arts outcomes. That is my pedagogy, and that is the center of the framework. From there, I think about pipeline. Who's holding me ethically and financially responsible? And out of the pipeline and out of the theory of change, programs and eventually a profile emerge. Now, to speak personally for a moment, my last solid cry probably came about 6 months ago when I first learned about Jamaria Hall. Before he could legally vote, Jamaria was suing the state of Michigan. He and a group of students from the worst performing high schools in the city of Detroit filed a lawsuit against their state, saying that Detroit denies children their constitutional right to literacy under the 14th Amendment of the American Constitution. Now, the idea of a constitutional right to literacy broke me open and exposed to the conflicts of my own civic instincts. The idea of a right to language, like a right to clean air or a right to love. How does a Black boy become an American? How does he learn his role to play? What if that role in part is to stand in his country's closet waiting for someone to imagine him as a monster in the dark? If I take everything that I love about being Black and everything that I love about being an American, are those things themselves in a right or loving relationship? if not some legal charter, who gives us permission to be our greatest loving selves? Who am I human if not free? Respectfully, I think that the notion of safeguarding freedoms assumes a deficit and the ceding of ground to conventional power. And I'm not sure if we ever win that battle. People ask me all the time, what can art do to help create an equitable society? But I think that's the wrong question. And it puts the onus on the wrong people. When you live in Washington, D.C., like I do, you quickly learn that the artists are the actual politicians, and most politicians are just performance artists. The actual question is, why aren't our healthcare systems more like music? Why doesn't our political apparatus operate more like the flow of a poem? In essentially asking, how do we defend ourselves, we subordinate our strategic potency, which is the stewardship of the public imagination. A significant reason why the arts are so fragile is because the collective body politic is not interrogating of itself, like Jamaria and his allies, whether or not inspiration is a human right. I'm subverting our questions here, thinking less about the premise of art making as an economy. Art making as an economy is subject to the macro structures of capitalism and electoral will. However, I do abide by the premise that artist intellect is a natural sociological resource and thus sovereign in its place in the human striving to be. I'm asking us of all to think of ourselves as stewards of an equitable future, with creativity as the primary currency that pays for the future that we seek. I ask of this assembled body, can we adjust our gravitational center? Can we wonder aloud, what steps must we take to position creativity and inspiration as indelible human rights? And then following from that presupposition, can we ask, is it possible to pedagogically choreograph social justice? How great is any country if there aren't great artists living in it? How many artists does it take to make a great country? How do we position artists in the moral infrastructure of our respective nations? Is there an architecture that responds both to the market and an aspirational moral imperative? In the United States, our systems of deportation, our prison system, they are beautifully, if not insidiously designed. We can incarcerate people better than anyone in the world, but can we design freedom? I feel myself stretched across multiple identities that range from my institutional perch, where I'm restricted and generative and bold, to my curatorial and artistic practice, where I am inquisitive and more politically provocative, to my citizen self, where I feel morally obligated to consider how freedom is designed, where I want to think strategically about the creative materials needed to build an equitable and inspired social vision. By necessity, I have to take an approach to leadership that is centered in the capital of creativity and also in the marketplace of American ideals. Artistic disruption, but in the context of federal bureaucracy. Co-joined practices funneled through the lever of a multi-million-dollar arts business federally tied to some version of the American social contract. I understand the co-responsibility of resource and integrity. Behind me, I feel the close footsteps of both my ancestors, to whom I owe a debt, and slave catchers who would have me dead. In my artistic practice, these beliefs impact how I work with classical organizations to forge investment in local communities, as I create spoken word concertos for orchestra and chorus. At the Kennedy Center, these beliefs have metabolized as an intentional creative ecosystem of people, organizations, and programs, all operating under the philosophy that an art center isn't just a place to present prefabricated culture. It is an incubator for a transformative future. For the most part, institutional efforts operate solely in the context of reconciliation, investment to correct a historical wrong, but there was and is an opportunity to position that same economy as design infrastructure. And that's really what I want to zero on as I leave you today. The idea of artists trafficking in the currencies of reconciliation, but also in the currencies of redemption. As a part of an equitable social design, what are the currencies that pay for the future we seek? I launched a program with our National Symphony Orchestra called the Cartography Project. We drew a map of incidents of violence all over the United States. And we committed to commissioning creative teams of composers and librettists, all under 45 from those locations, a map with Black dignity as the prompt. Their commission was to compose chamber works later to be performed by the National Symphony Orchestra and the Washington National Opera. Pivotally, the Cartography Project doesn't ask composers or audiences to stay in a place of trauma. It asks of all parties, what is our collective role in recovering from struggle? What is the specific role of music in initiating conversations of healing?
What happened on that playground?
In less than 2 seconds and from 4 to 7 feet away,
New questions in the
woman
Breonna
fired.
Taylor case, which has been sparking protests across the
12-year-old
country.
But no bystander heard that or any warning before the shots. Trying to talk to investigators.
The politics surrounding, Breonna's death are better fought in the streets.
It's great. Does anyone have more milk? I don't. My whole face is like burning out.
He was peacefully protesting somebody. We was kneeling, and it started to come up, and it got aggressive because we was kneeling.
So what I was much more interested in doing was finding a way to walk that line, because regardless, it will be a political piece. It's all we have. I think it's the thing that everyone tries to take away from us. Historically, people have tried to take away and have taken away, our homes, our lives, our livelihoods, our future. And all we've really had to cling on to is our dignity, and not even to prove that we're not these, like savages that we get painted as, but to remind everyone. I think Black dignity to me is a path of self-discovery, this thing that we all have, that we all deserve, and that we all need to share, something that we can't run from, something that we have to walk down towards and try to bring as many people along as we can.
Black Lives Matter is not a response to extrajudicial violence. It's a response to an inadequate, inept, racist execution of law in regards to the loss of Black life. If you want to kill me over here and I want to live over here, I'm not building a bridge where we meet in the middle. I will make culture here. And you can use that as a bridge to come over here where I'm alive. I want my son to live.
The Cartography Project is more than a pipeline or commissioning initiative. It's one of 20 active impact programs that I've designed and are running at the Kennedy Center, serving as a creative ecosystem of partners. It's a systemic approach that's led to the development of a social impact endowment fund at the Kennedy Center. Cartography is unique in that we've linked it with a financial partner at a major investment bank and created a Black Wealth Initiative. Through cartography, we've been able to generate resources and stakeholdership for the family foundations of Breonna Taylor, of Philando Castile, of Eric Garner, among others. It's a curatorial system, but it's also an engine for impact investment. We are in a moment of accelerated cultural erasure. One way to combat it is through cultural preservation, particularly in service of historically stigmatized communities. But I believe the opposing force of cultural erasure is cultural generation. Artists make cultural edge. How do institutions facilitate equitable stakes at that edge? How do we help to position institutions as incubators for a future of both cultural practice and cultural stakes? I'm a child of Haitian immigrants. It's a tradition to do it all in the service of a liberation dream not yet born. Do we want to protect artistic process and output? Yes. But further, we want to intentionally, forthrightly, and legislatively hold art structures and ourselves as accountable for the design of an equitable horizon. I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for your time.